All right, so here's some nitty-gritty. Here are the short-term objective STO components. I have to remind myself to spell out the acronyms sometimes because for some of you in the audience, it's new and it's just too many letters. So here's the BC Ministry of Education formula for how to write a good short-term objective, and this should make it a SMART objective. It should specify the date by which it should be achieved. That's the due date. And again, as I mentioned not that long ago, it's not June. It's earlier than June. Under which conditions? That is the specific context in which the behavior will occur. And as the question addressed when we came back from break, as you've moved to online instruction in COVID, the context has totally changed from the classroom setting to the home setting. So you need to know the context in which the behavior will occur. Think of that as the antecedent. We're going back to our ABC, antecedent, behavior, consequence. The short-term objective identifies the antecedent, and it therefore identifies the behavior that will occur. Later on in tactics, we'll address the consequence aspect of it. So under which conditions the student will do what? It is the action, the verb, the thing that they will do, right? Verb, 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 verb. Get that tattooed on your arm. Good IEPs have verbs. And how well is the criterion, which I just described, isn't always 80%. It may be better than 80%. So let me run you through some examples of these. By December 1st, 2016, there's the deadline, Freddie will identify 12 basic shapes with 100% accuracy on 5 trials. So you've got the date, you've got how well, 100% over 5 trials. You've got what will he do, identify basic shapes. And again, the ideal IEP, the perfect IEP is the unicorn. You're always trying to make this better. This example could already be made better. It doesn't identify very specifically, or you could be more specific in terms of under what conditions will you identify 12 basic shapes. And so if you want to make this more specific, and we usually do, I want to know before we leave the meeting, show me the list of the 12 basic shapes, right? Otherwise, you might get to June and you're like, well, we've learned 6 basic shapes. Great, we're halfway to that objective. What were the others? Oh, well, we didn't agree on them. You should leave the IEP with agreement on what will be taught. If it says 12 basic shapes, name them. And then the context can certainly be enhanced here. Is this 2-dimensional representations on paper and worksheets? Is this 3-dimensional objects? Is this computer animation? You have to be specific on the context. You can't just assume, in particular for learners with autism for whom you might be teaching something like this, that most kids would come in with, that they will learn it in one modality and then magically generalize it to all other modalities, right? By March 1st, 2017, Freddie will correctly separate 30 compound words. For example, cowboy becomes cow and boy, with 90% accuracy over 3 trials each. So this is better, right? You've got the deadline. You've got what he will do, which is separate those compound words. You want to know which compound words. Let's make a master target list, and we will teach those. And when we've reached the end of that list, you've probably achieved this objective. 90%. And you might ask, well, why not 100%? And the teacher might say, none of my kids do this 100%. Okay, well then, considering that the student here, Freddie, has autism, doing 90% might make him better than most of his friends. This actually might even be okay to reduce a little bit more to make it really representative of the class norm, right? Or no, you want him to do better than the class norm. Individual decision. So I'm going to take you through building short-term objectives. There's 2 images here that aren't in your slides, but that's okay. You can just write down the names. There are 2 very popular preschool intervention curricula and program guides and assessments. They serve all of those functions for kids with autism. One of them is the Assessment of Basic Language and Learning Skills. This is a curriculum and a skill tracking system for preschool kids with autism. And so you see the domains here are primarily language focused. This is a very language heavy or emphasized program. So you've got things like visual performance, this category here, which is matching and sorting, which is very congruent with skills you need to be successful in kindergarten. This big column here is receptive language. You've got the ability to imitate, and yesterday I taught you about why imitation is so critical so that it becomes observational learning. And you've got requesting and labeling things and answering questions. So these columns represent primarily language targets, and each one of these rows that build up represent a developmental progression from the least sophisticated, most basic skills at the bottom to the most sophisticated. And so this functions as a curriculum because you would assess where a student is, and then you would teach them up these curriculum ladders. And the highest skills that are represented here, right, the nitty-gritty don't matter, don't get distracted by that. The idea is that this guides skill acquisition, really short-term objective acquisition for early intervention for kids with autism. But if you apply this assessment to a typically developing student who doesn't have autism, by the time they enter kindergarten, your average 5-year-old would have all of these skills filled in. The whole thing would be colored in. Kindergarten is predicated on the assumption that every student coming in can do all of the skills that are represented in something like the assessment of basic language and learning skills. It makes sense for a student who doesn't have all of these foundational skills to continue working on them maybe when they get to kindergarten and grade 1. If they've been doing well, they can kind of close that developmental gap, and that will give them more of the foundational skills to be successful in elementary school. However, if you're still working on these skills, if this is informing your programming, how you pick your short-term objectives when the child is in grade 6 or grade 8, now we have a problem because you're continuing to pick preschool goals when the student is far from preschool, right? They're far removed from preschool. And that's a misuse of an assessment like this. So that's one of the concerns about seeing a program like this assisting in short-term objective identification in schools is you can't follow a preschool curriculum forever in school system. Similarly, there's the Verbal Behavior Milestones and Placement Program, the VB-MAP. These two are very comparable early intervention curricula, functionally the same with some important differences between them. Most behavior analysts have both of these in their library that they use for teaching skills, in particular language skills, to preschool kids with autism. You can use the Verbal Behavior Milestones and Placement Program, the VB-MAP that you see here, again, similarly to guide your short-term objective identification for preschoolers and continue to have it inform your objectives in early elementary. But if you continue to use it past early elementary, it's not what it was intended for. And now you're going to have a student working on really basic preschool things as they move into middle elementary and upper elementary school. That's problematic. There's a solution to that. So that's just a word of caution about using these common curriculum for kids with autism to guide STOs for too long. This is the assessment of functional living skills. And it comes from one of the authors, it comes from the author of the ABLES that I just shared with you. And this is in your slides so that you can look this up. I believe on the right side you see there are a number of different protocols that target different domains. So you've got a basic living domain, and the basic living is broad ideas in terms of what everybody needs to achieve some independence and quality of life and dignity in adulthood. It is a broad assessment of functional living skills. And then they have these other protocols that get more specific. So you can purchase one that is all about community participation, one that is all about independence at home, one about school skills, and another for vocational skills. These are functional living skills curriculum in different domains. These are very, very practical. I widely recommend that every high school or middle school should have these on their library shelf, in their resource shelf. And it isn't that you need to follow this plan exactly, but again, each one of these columns represents a domain of learning, a domain of life skills, and each of the rows within it represents a skill that builds in a developmental sequence from the lowest at the bottom to full adult skills at the top, roughly. And the use for this in a school setting, from middle school upwards, is as a brainstorming tool. You don't need to follow this specifically, but you might look at it and just look at each of the skills that are represented in the manual that goes along with this, and it will cause you to think about things that you otherwise probably wouldn't think about. The teacher that I mentioned earlier who is needing to replace IEP objectives very rapidly because the students are requiring it, she's using these assessment functional living skills curriculum and finding them very, very practical because they're getting her to teach things that she just wouldn't have thought about on her own. One example from the school skills is that it will ask questions about, can your student put a piece of paper into a 3-hole punch and 3-hole punch it, and then open a 3-ring binder and put that piece of paper into the binder and close it? And if it rips, can they put those little reinforcing circles on it? And can they load a stapler and use a stapler to secure pages together? And in and of themselves, those are very, very tiny, discrete skills that don't matter a huge amount in the bigger picture. But often we look at those and we go, we've never asked our student to do that. Yeah, all of his or her peers can do that, and they've been doing it for years. We've just been doing it for them. That's often the result of looking at this very detailed breakdown of functional living skills. Is you look at things and go, we've just never given him or her the opportunity, or we've just always done it for them. And it's kind of a reality check that we should stop doing it for them, and we should create opportunities so that they can learn these things. Even if there's a little discrete skills, because when you start to put together lots of discrete skills, you build a more robust repertoire of competency and independence. So for middle school and high school, absolutely, if that's who your child is talking to you as parents, or if you are a teacher in middle or high school, this is an absolutely fantastic resource. I've never had a teacher go out and buy it and go, well, that was bad advice. Everyone thanks me for putting them onto the AFLs. I should get some type of royalty for promoting it, but I don't. No conflict of interest. That said, there are some things when you look at the bottom of each of these domains that kids can start working on in kindergarten in grade 1. So you can actually look at the lower levels of these different functional living skills domains and be building some of it into self-determination goals early on in elementary school. So just add that to your purchase list for Christmas time. All right, so on the left in the box, you see the formula for what's needed in a quality short-term objective, according to the BC Ministry of Education. By date, the context, the verb that the student will do, and the criterion for mastery. So let's do some error analysis, shall we? Fred will improve his question-asking skills by using the 5 WH questions to expand his knowledge and ask for clarification. That's not entirely terrible, but it's missing some of these elements. There's no criterion for mastery to know that he's achieved it. There's no timeline by which this should be taught. The context is unclear. If he's going to improve his question-asking behavior to ask WH questions, is that around literacy in his language arts class? Is that around not understanding in math? Is that having to do with social interactions where he's asking questions? You need to be specific, and this lacks specificity, right? So be specific. And expanding knowledge and asking for clarification are arguably very different things, right? So sometimes you look at a goal like this and you're like, okay, we can actually break this apart into 2 separate things and apply our formula to it. Right now, all I'm doing is error identification. We'll do a couple of these, and then we'll move into fixing them. Kelly will learn to share with friends and engage in turn-taking. So there's no criterion or timeline there. Sharing and turn-taking are 2 totally different skills, right? Sharing might mean I've got something and I give you part of it. Turn-taking means I give it entirely to you and now I don't have it for a period of time and I have to learn to get it back. And for a lot of kids, that's very untrustworthy and aversive to them. So turn-taking and sharing might be completely separate goals. And under which conditions? When are you going to teach sharing and turn-taking? Is this with food at snack time? Is this with play? Is this on the outside at recess? When is this happening? Right? It's lacking specificity. And if it's with turn-taking goes on for so many turns and then you're finished. So be specific and quantify the number of turns. For some kids, it's going to be in the context of a board game. They're going to engage in 1 turn exchange, and then that's the first objective because that's going to take some teaching, and then you'll level it up from there. Fred will avoid becoming frustrated by improving his problem-solving skills. So again, no criterion or timeline. When will this be achieved? How will we know it's been achieved? Under which context or circumstances is he engaging in problem-solving? We have no idea. What does problem solving look like? Problem solving could be taking an action. Problem solving could just be sitting and waiting and not getting frustrated, right? We need to be highly specific. So I would identify, to start with, 1 circumstance that tends to be most frustrating for Fred and teach him a measurable verb to deal with that circumstance. And once we've achieved that, then level it up and evolve it. One of the questions I often ask in the context of skill acquisition is, what's the next evolution? What's the next evolution? As soon as we achieve something, we take a minute to celebrate, pat ourselves on the back, and then we ask, what's the next evolution? We're constantly pushing forward. All right, remember from yesterday, one of those faulty notions that we have to have endless patience? We're very impatient. We want to move forward. Our students are behind. Linda will improve her ability to follow 2 to 3 step instructions. Partially okay, but there are limitations. No criterion or timeline, and no context, right? In which context will she follow 2 to 3 step instructions? Is this the gym teacher giving instructions for how to play a game? Is this multi-step instructions in a home ec class? Is this putting your stuff away in a kindergarten classroom? We're missing context. Kim will learn basic addition, shapes, and colors. There's no criterion or timeline for any of these things. We don't understand the conditions under which she has to identify shapes or colors or addition. These are actually 3 separate goals, or you could break them into an addition goal and a shapes and colors goal. And what does learn mean? Is she matching shapes? Is she receptively identifying shapes? Is she labeling shapes? Is she drawing shapes? Just because you can do one of those doesn't mean you can do all of those things. It is lacking specificity. And what is basic addition? Is basic addition adding 1 plus 1? Is it adding single digit plus single digit? Or are we getting into double digits? Be specific. Be specific. Tim will participate in weekly social skills groups. This is not a short-term objective. Right? This does not specify his learning. Social skills, as I mentioned earlier, is a context unto itself, right? But you can come up with really good short-term objectives in social skills. All right. I feel like I'm talking really fast. Do we have any complaints online? We're okay. Okay. Whew. Freddie will read faster. Richard will talk slower. Let's do some practice here. So this is an exercise in applying our rubric that you see down at the bottom there, your little visual support, to make it better, not necessarily perfect. I'm just going to try to make it better. And some of you are going to be behind your camera on the other side of the internet going, I've got an idea that would make that even better, which is awesome. So instead of Freddie will read faster, Freddie will read 110 words per minute with less than 4 errors using grade 4 materials by March 1st, 2017. Highly specific. What do we have here? He will read 110 words per minute. With grade 4 materials. So grade 4 materials is the context. His speed is what he will do. You've got the criterion, right, built in there with words per minute and the acceptable error rate, and deadline for achieving this. This is a pretty fine, pretty intelligent, pretty measurable goal, right? This is a SMART goal. Is it SMART? Oh, yes, it is. Freddie will develop an understanding of why we use manners. Ugh, shoot me. No, he won't understand why we use manners. Freddie will use his manners. Freddie will use please and thank you, that's the verb, 100% of the time, that's the criterion. In interactions with peers and adults during lunch while giving and receiving, that's the context, 3 times per day by December 19th, 2020, right? Much, much better. Fred will talk to friends twice per week at 80% accuracy. Okay, here's another soapbox moment for me. If anything worth teaching is worth teaching on the most regular basis possible, daily if possible. What did we learn yesterday? One of the big takeaways from yesterday is the greatest predictor of learning, anything for anybody, is the number of learning opportunities, the number of trials presented to them, the learning opportunities. So twice a week isn't going to cut it. If this is a meaningful goal that's realistic for him to achieve, this should be worked on daily. And there might be some circumstances, some groups or things that only occur a couple times a week, and that can be the settings during those days, but then on the other days, how are we going to go about teaching this? Freddie will initiate 3 social interactions with peers with 100% accuracy on a daily basis during recess by Christmas break. So again, you're seeing those 4 elements brought into taking the poorly worded STO and making it a SMART objective. It's measurable. And it's very, very specific. That's okay. Sometimes people are a little weirded out by, wow, it's so specific. But that allows you to get it done and move on to the next thing. And that's the problem you want to have, is achievement and moving on and needing to come up with new goals as opposed to the end of the year and we haven't achieved any of the goals. Freddie will increase his receptive language. Freddie will learn to identify via pointing primary and secondary colors and 12 basic shapes presented in 2D and 3D formats with 100% accuracy by the first report card period. And this can be taught daily. You know exactly what he's going to do. The response topography, the verb, the action he engages in is a point. The context is 2D and 3D basic shapes and those primary and secondary colors. Right? This is very specific and measurable. Right? Think also about when you have the IEP, and if it often kind of falls to the education assistant to take it and run with it. If it's vague, they're not sure how to go about doing these things. The more specific it is, the more it's like a set of instructions for how to help this student learn. Freddie will urinate in the toilet at school with 80% accuracy. Again, here's a problem. Why 80%? Freddie will stay dry in underwear and ask to use the bathroom to urinate 100% of the time during the school day by spring break 2020. So the action is staying dry and or asking to use the bathroom. The context is at school while wearing underwear. 100% because that's competence, and by deadline, spring break. Freddie will use visual supports. Sometimes a suggested short-term objective can be removed and made an environmental adaptation. Not something that I've talked about. Many of you in the teaching side of the audience, you're familiar with these. Environmental adaptations are good practices that we employ as teachers that we just use to enable the success of our students, but they're not things that we teach our students to do. So an environmental adaptation, for example, most kindergarten teachers will have is the shape of the day on the wall, on the board. All students can reference it, and it's very important to the kindergarten class. We might have another variation of that we use for our kindergarten student with autism, right? A little mini version of the teacher's shape of the day. This is just a tool that we use that helps the student be more successful, but it's not something that we're requiring them to learn. So it's not a short-term objective. So using these visual supports, or if it's people using them with him, continue to do that, but just recognize this doesn't have to be a short-term objective in and of itself. Freddie will learn prepositions, and I talked a little bit about prepositions yesterday, right? Those are location words like on and under. And again, Freddie will learn prepositions, doesn't tell me which prepositions under which context. So Freddie will learn to, this needs some more discussion. Right? Is he going to learn on, in, under, beside, in front, behind, around, through, and over? Are there other prepositions or just a subset of those prepositions? Is he identifying these in fixed arrangements where he just points to the preposition when he hears it? Is he hearing a preposition and then placing an object? And this is more complicated with a neutral object, like I'll take this Kleenex box. This Kleenex box doesn't have a front or a back, right? So when I'm holding the Kleenex box in front of me, if I say put something in front, this is in front, right? Because it's relevant to me. But imagine that this Kleenex box had a smiley face on it and it's facing you on the camera. Now the smiley face makes this the front. And so I can no longer put this here for in front because it's not relative to me, it's relative to the front of the Kleenex box. So there's perspective taking that's required. Right? When you get into many language skills and fundamental knowledge, you have to kind of break it down. Exactly how are we teaching this? And recognize that for many of our students with autism for whom it's appropriate to teach these things, they don't learn it in one exposure, in one context, and then generalize it like magic to all other contexts. We actually, it's probably a safer assumption to assume you're going to need to think through all the variations and teach those than do this train and hope strategy where you train one and you hope it generalizes. Sometimes that works, but I wouldn't put my eggs in that basket. Freddie will learn to understand what he reads. Lacks specificity. The idea is good. What does understand mean? So a better example here is using grade 3 materials. Freddie will learn to identify the main character, setting, and problem in a short story in both question, answer, and worksheet formats with 80% accuracy by spring break 2021. So you've got your deadline, you've got your criterion. In this case, it is that magical 80%. Or that default 80%, but we didn't just pick this arbitrarily. We asked the teacher, and the teacher said, I'd be quite happy if it was 80%. To me, that's what we should be aiming at. Great, the teacher's criteria informs the short-term objective. The material is clear, it's with grade 3 materials. And you actually don't know from this, what grade is Freddie in? Freddie might be in grade 5. And when you have a goal like he'll understand what he reads, and he's in grade 5, people tend to grab the stuff in the grade 5 classroom and give him grade 5 material, but he needs grade 3 material. That's where his oral reading fluency and comprehension and language knowledge is at, right? Freddie will learn to type. That's a life skill. Freddie will learn to type so many words per minute using only home row keys with 90% accuracy by December 19th, 2020. That's the last day of school before Christmas break 2020. Here you might be sitting around the IEP thinking, we're not really sure what to fill in for the XX words per minute, so we're going to go and maybe test a few representative sample peers from the class to see what are the other kids doing, and maybe yoke our goal to what the same aged peers are doing. And he's only using home row because this is new to him. We just want to get fluency with home row before we start reaching up to other letters. And 90% because that's not bad for a student his age who's learning to type. Nobody is doing it perfectly. Freddie will learn to transition 75% of the time. Why 75% of the time? How about pick one transition that's a target and teach that to mastery so he can do it 100% of the time, right? One transition 100% of the time is a good basis to then build from versus intermittent success with a bunch of transitions. So when the bell sounds at recess, Freddie will independently line up to come inside 90% of the time by April 1st, 2021. So you've got the action, he'll go and line up. You've got the context, when the bell rings, that's the antecedent, and the context, 90% by deadline. You ask why 90%, and the classroom teacher looks at you and says, none of my students line up 100% of the time. Every student from time to time won't hear the bell, will be so engrossed in their game that they just need a reminder. And if he does it 90% or better, he's like as good as everyone else or better than most. That's good enough. That's natural. We don't expect perfection because they're kids at recess, right? When prompted, Freddie will learn to raise his hand to ask questions in class. So this is a particular issue for me. When prompted isn't the learning outcome. Prompting is a strategy. After lunch, we're going to talk about the strategies. So prompts are instructional tactics. The tactic doesn't need to be in the wording. It's what you're going to do to facilitate the learning, right? If it's in the wording, and there are always exceptions, right? I can hear some of you going, but there are always exceptions. In most cases, I'd be advocating for he may need prompts initially, but the goal is for him to learn to ask questions in class. In the tactics, we will have use prompting and prompt fading, so eventually he does not require the prompt, as opposed to saying, well, we'll have one short-term objective where he can do it with prompts, and then we'll have another objective where he can do it without prompts. Just keep it simple, keep it lean and mean. One objective, what he's going to do, and the tactics are what we do. Freddie will learn to improve his focus. Sounds good in theory. How do you know that he is focused or isn't focused? What does focus look like? A student could be sitting in front of their work and staring at it, and from a distance you go, seems focused, but they're thinking about a video game or what they're going to have for lunch or something that someone said to them, right? Just because you're looking at something doesn't mean you're doing it or you're focused on it. So a better objective for Freddie would be, Freddie will complete teacher-assigned desk work in STEM, so he's a high school student in his science technology coursework, by the specified time, which the teacher identifies a different amount of time every day. That's why it's left as specified time. 100% of the time by spring break 2021, and the teacher said he can absolutely achieve 100%. This is, he's not maintaining his focus, attention to work. When I ask the students to get to work, he's just sitting there fiddling around, not getting his work done. And so I want him to finish what I've specified by a deadline under the strategies and tactics. The EA will review the contingency with him. They will put a timer on the teacher's desk to remind him, and he's sitting right in front of that teacher's desk and timer. Right? So the strategies will be yoked to this, and this is actually a real objective that a teacher had input on.